Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're having a great week. In this video, I have a confession, or more than one, because I'd like to discuss the confessional poets. I've been reading a couple of them the past 2 weeks, and the confessional poets are this informal, not really like self-identified grouping of poets from the middle of the 20th century in the US who I find fascinating. Now, they can really be like deep and dark and not poets or writers you want to spend time with when you're down as well. But they're writers and poets who I find their work can be a fascinating window into that depth of the human experience. Last week I was reading from Anne Sexton's early poems, and then Allan at Big Hard Books and Classics is doing a whole like read through almost of John Berryman's Dream Songs, and so those are two of the confessional poets, along with the great WD Snodgrass. This is Heart's Needle. And then Sylvia Plath is often kind of in that conversation as well. So I'd like to talk about the confessional poets. I find them, as I said, interesting. And in my reading, and again, this is just my reading, not anyone else's, but in my reading, I find them to be an extension of the Romantic poets from the late 18th century, early 19th century, who are very popular. And then I do want to talk at the end about Frank Stanford, I think a much lesser known poet, and writing about 10 years later, but someone who I think stems in part from that line of poetry. So the confessional poets are fascinating because they take and own the I voice of poetry, and they write about experiences that are very real, that are very authentic, and that can be truly horrifying, truly traumatic. For many of them, it wasn't that they had a mental health struggle, it was a mental health war that they experienced. And that shows in their poetry. Snodgrass, kind of, along with Allan Ginsberg, were two of the early confessional poets that, again, that's a label that was put on them, not that they were necessarily owning. In fact, many of them said, don't use that. Berryman said, I haven't been to confession since I was 12. But they owned what their life experiences had been, what their life choices had been, and they owned it through an interesting perspective in many ways. So Ginsberg famously would discuss his sex life and write about that in a time when that didn't really happen, and particularly from writers who were very open about the fact that they were gay. Snodgrass wrote about his divorce, and he has this astonishing little stanza in Riddle that kind of speaks to this. You have the damnedest friends and seem to think you have some right to think. You have kept keen our arguments and souls, so we have grown closely together where most people shrink. You sleep tonight with threatening relations. In El Dorado, I am here alone. To tell you, vive la difference, we have seen the energetic first stuff of creation, so that today, if there is a world between us, it's our own. And there's just a pathos to that. That he's writing about the ways in which the arguments and the fights they've had have almost been what's kept the marriage together, and recognizing that they're separated, that divorce is imminent, and then claiming that fractured relationship in a time where divorce was rarely spoken of in the U.S. That gives a sample of one of the issues that can arise in confessional poetry, which is sometimes the reveling in it or the narcissism of poetry in general, but of confessional poetry specifically. And I think that too is something that stems from sort of the Romantic movement. But Snodgrass and Ginsberg were two who took it in different directions around what they were writing about, what they were willing to talk about in their poetry. And then that is advanced even more from writers like Anne Sexton or Sylvia Plath. This is the Bell Jar, which is prose, not poetry. But each of them, as I said, really experienced deep mental health like wars that they were experiencing. And with Sexton, there were later allegations around abuse and so that's something that we have to be aware of as we're reading this. As I said, this isn't necessarily poetry I like to delve into if I'm down, or that I would ever recommend to somebody who's down. I didn't read any of these poets in 2020. I'm just going to be very clear on that. But Sexton, again, owns these experiences in a deeply horrifying way. Child, the current of your breath is 6 days long. You lie, a small knuckle on my white bed. Lie fisted like a snail, so small and strong at my breast. Your lips are animals you are fed with love. At first hunger is not wrong. The nurses nod their caps, you are shepherded down starch halls with the other unnested throng in wheeling baskets. You tip like a cup, your head moving to my touch. You sense the way we belong. But this is an institution bed. You will not know me very long. And the shattering final two lines in that opening stanza, where we have a scene that is extraordinarily common, that sense of mother and child is, in many of the creation or origin stories, Romulus and Remus, Zeus, so many we have that sense. And so Sexton opens with that and then reveals at the end the truth, the true nature of what her experience is, what this infant's experience will be, in a heart-wrenching way, and she's opening her soul and pouring it out through poetry here, and so again, that's what the confessional poets are bringing on a very clear level, and I find that to be an extension of the romantic poets, where, to be very, very, very reductive, the romantics sort of have this sense of be true to nature by being true to yourself. I did this because I felt like it, and this is what I saw, and here's what I thought. And so it became this very I sense, and owning it because they wanted to. And with the confessional poets, I think sometimes there's a sense of, this is what I did, this is how I felt, and I'm owning it because I had to, not because I wanted to, but I wanted to because I saw no other way. This was the way. And again, it can feel very dark. It can feel almost nihilistic at times. But it's a verse there. Berryman's dream songs, of course, are interesting. I wouldn't recommend all of John Berryman's poetry. There's these huge collected editions, but the dream songs are strong. One of the things that becomes strange in the dream songs, and this kind of from my video on Monday, Berryman he creates Henry in here, who is sort of his surrogate character. He uses Henry as his I voice. But he also creates Mr. Bones, and he worked a lot with Ralph Ellison on trying to build Mr. Bones and the language Mr. Bones would use, but it does come off inadequately is probably the generous way to do it. At times it feels reductive in a way that is patronizing, if not racist. But the dream songs can be fascinating. The windows in which to the world as a whole. So we see passages in here that discuss Vietnam. There are passages that are just examining how Berryman is perceiving the world and the Cold War and the conflict, not just that he's experiencing and his confession, but his confession of his view of the world in a very real sense. And so Berryman can be interesting. And I had mentioned, of course, Sylvia Plath as a hallmark of the confessional poets. And the bell jar, I think, is probably almost more popularly known than her poetry, but she's a very strong poet as well. But one writer I want to highlight here at the end is Frank Stanford, who was writing in roughly the 1970s and was from Arkansas. And so he's not nearly as well known as any of the poets I've mentioned. And he's not necessarily a pure confessional poet grouping with the others. There is a sense of earthy naturalism to all of these poets. I think it stands in contrast to some of the more formal poetry from someone like certainly the modernists like T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound especially, but even poets like John Ashbery. But with Stanford, it's the naturalism, but it's also through the vein of Stephen Crane, and it feels like this is someone who in many ways feels like a poetic heir to John Berryman. And so this is the beginning of the Singing Knives. The dogs woke me up. I looked out the window. Jimmy ran down the road with the knife in his mouth. He was naked, and the moon was a dead man floating down the river. Just a great image there, Frank. I called the knife the Holy Ghost. I took all my clothes off and jumped down the hole in the outhouse. I grabbed the yellow jacket nest and held it over my heart. I pumped cold water over myself and wallowed in the mud. I walked through the snake den barefooted. I swam the river at midnight with the hand and a blue feather in my mouth and the Holy Ghost around my neck. And so again, there's this sense of almost like mythic creation in the way that Walt Whitman has himself almost as this character in his poems, who he's building this myth of himself through his poetry. And Stanford attempts that, and he's not necessarily quite as successful as Whitman, but he has a sensibility that just feels very raw, like we're in the mud. We're blood is in these verses here, and he's really taking us to a place that I don't think, not too many writers come from Arkansas. It's not an area that's written about frequently, and Stanford tries to own that and explore what that is, and explore the many peoples who have lived there, the native peoples who have lived there. So again, you do sometimes come across like racist language in here, but that's something that we need to just be aware of and recognize. But as a confession, it can be a deep window into those depths. So those are confessional poets. I would add Leonard Michaels, who was not a poet but a short story writer primarily, and I think many of his stories feel analogous to the ways in which we have the bell jar from Sylvia Plath, but also the sensibilities of those confessional poets. I think Leonard Michaels' stories just fit perfectly alongside those. And of course the poets came in for criticism, justifiably, but also there were people like Richard Wilbur, and I love Wilbur's translations of Molière. They are my favorites. But Richard Wilbur couldn't stand them, so you may not either. But I did want to highlight the confessional poets, and let me know if you've read any of these poets, or if you have any favorite works from them. And again, I hope everybody's doing well. Thanks.